Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Incorruptible Saints, focusing our gaze upon a silent figure resting in a silver and crystal casket in the heart of France. Imagine the town of Nevers. It is a place where time folds in on itself, where the stone walls of the convent of Saint Gildard hold secrets that have breathed for over a century. Before we reach the light of the display, we walk back through the corridors of the 19th century, feeling the cool, damp air and the ticking of a clock. On the 16th of April, 1879, a woman known as Sister Marie Bernard drew her final breath. To the world, she was Bernadette Sauberus, the girl who saw the Virgin Mary in a muddy grotto. She was 35, her body ravaged by asthma and tuberculosis. In her final hours, she sat in a wooden armchair by a blazing fire in the Holy Cross Infirmary, her breathing labored, her small hands clutching a rosary. The nuns gathered, their soft prayers mingling with the crackle of the hearth. As the afternoon sun shifted across the floor, Bernadette whispered her final plea for mercy and slipped away. There was no fanfare, only the profound silence of a life completed in suffering. She was laid to rest in a double casket of oak and lead, buried deep within the chapel vault. For 30 years, Bernadette remained in the dark. Above her, the world changed. Seasons bled into one another. The lime trees in the gardens grew taller, their leaves whispering in the winds of the Never region. The heavy stone slab of the vault gathered dust, and the memory of the visionary became a legend that the church now sought to verify. In the year 1909, the silence was broken. It was a Wednesday morning, the 22nd of September at 8:30. The air was crisp, and a somber group of doctors, masons, and officials gathered. They came with tools of iron, prepared to find the grim reality of 3 decades of decay. They expected the smell of the earth, the ruin of the flesh, and the brittle remains of a woman who had been gone for a generation. The masons began their work, the rhythmic clink of their chisels echoing against the vaulted ceiling. It was a slow, methodical process. The mayor and his deputy stood as silent witnesses, their breath visible in the cool morning air. When the heavy stone was finally hoisted away, it revealed the wooden casket, damp and dark from the moisture of the crypt. The wood was unscrewed with care, revealing the inner lining of lead. You can almost hear the sharp, metallic scrape of the shears as the doctors began to cut through the metal. There was a palpable tension in the room, a collective holding of breath. What lay beneath 30 years of damp earth and sealed metal? As the lid was finally pulled back, a soft gasp rippled through the witnesses. There was no foul odor, no scent of the grave. Instead, there was a stillness that defied every law of nature. There she lay, as if caught in a shallow sleep. Bernadette's face was a dull, waxy white, her features perfectly preserved. Her head was tilted slightly to the left, as if she had just turned away from a dream. Her eyes were closed, the lids still smooth, the lashes clinging to the skin of her right eye. Most striking were her hands. They were crossed over her breast, the skin clinging to the underlying muscle and bone in a way that looked remarkably lifelike. Between her fingers, she still held her rosary, but the iron links had rusted into a dark, crumbly red. The crucifix she held had turned green with oxidation. The fabric of her habit was damp, heavy with the moisture of the vault, yet the flesh beneath it remained intact. The doctors, Jordan and David, leaned in. They noted the perfection of her fingernails and the subtle veins still visible on her forearms. The sisters who had known her in life stood in awe. They remarked that she looked exactly as she had on the day they laid her to rest, save for a slight shift in the position of her hands. The body was washed by the nuns, its skin supple and joints still somewhat flexible. As we linger here in the dim light of 1909, we must ask ourselves what force kept the elements at bay. Was it the lead lining, the specific chemistry of the soil, or something that transcends the physical world? We are at the beginning of a mystery that will only deepen as the years pull us closer to the present. For now, the heavy stone is replaced, but the image of the sleeping nun remains burned into the minds of those who saw her. Close your eyes and see her there, waiting in the cool dark of the chapel, untouched by the hands of time. To understand the miracle of the woman who would not decay, we must travel back to the mid-19th century, to a small, humble town nestled at the foot of the Pyrenees Mountains. It was 1844 when Bernadette Sauberus was born, the eldest child of a miller. Though her early years were filled with the rhythmic sound of the water wheel and the sweet dust of flour, prosperity was fleeting. By the time she was a young teenager, her family had been cast into the depths of abject poverty. They were forced to live in a single, cramped room known as the cachot, a former prison cell that was so damp and dark that even the local authorities had deemed it unfit for inmates. Imagine the chill of that stone floor, the smell of wood smoke and old moisture clinging to the walls, and the sound of several children huddling together for warmth in a space no larger than a modern bedroom. Bernadette, already frail and suffering from chronic asthma, spent her days gathering scraps of wood to keep her family from freezing. The turning point of her quiet life arrived on a cold Thursday morning, the 11th of February, 1858. Accompanied by her sister and a friend, Bernadette walked toward the grotto of Massabielle, a rocky outcrop near the river Gave. The other girls had already waded through the shallow, icy water, but Bernadette, fearing a flare-up of her asthma from the cold, stayed behind on the bank. As she began to pull off her stockings, a strange sensation filled the air. She later described hearing a sound like a great gust of wind, yet the trees and the grass around her remained perfectly still. In a small, natural niche high in the rock face, a dazzling light began to glow. Out of that radiance emerged a figure she simply called "that thing" in her local dialect. It was a young woman, no older than 16 or 17, dressed in a robe of pure white with a blue sash and golden roses resting upon her feet. The vision did not speak that day, but it smiled with a peace that would define the rest of Bernadette's life. Over the course of 5 months, 18 visions occurred in that same dusty cave. Each time, the crowds grew larger, though no one but Bernadette could see the lady in white. The girl was subjected to relentless questioning by the police and the clergy, many of whom believed she was either hallucinating or playing a cruel trick on the town. Yet, she remained unshakable. During the 9th vision, the lady told her to go to the fountain and wash. Confused, as there was no water in the grotto, Bernadette began to dig with her bare hands into the dry, muddy earth. The onlookers watched in horror as she smeared her face with the sludge and chewed on bitter weeds, thinking she had finally lost her mind. But the next morning, a clear stream of water began to trickle from the spot she had scratched. That tiny trickle soon became a flowing spring that, to this day, attracts millions of people seeking healing for their own broken bodies. As the fame of the grotto exploded, Bernadette sought only to disappear. She had no interest in the spotlight or the money being offered for her story. In 1866, she left her beloved Lourdes forever to join the Sisters of Charity in Nevers. She hoped that behind the convent walls, she would finally find the quiet she craved. However, her body continued to fail her. The asthma that had plagued her since childhood was joined by a much more aggressive enemy, tuberculosis of the bone. It manifested most cruelly in her right knee, which swelled to a terrifying size and caused her constant, agonizing pain. She spent years in the convent's infirmary, often unable to move or even lie down comfortably. When the other sisters marveled at her patience, she simply told them that her job was to be ill, offering her suffering as a silent prayer. She was a shepherdess who had found a spring of life for others, but would find no such physical relief for herself. By the spring of 1879, Bernadette's strength was completely spent. She was only 35 years old, yet she looked much older, her frame weathered by decades of illness and the harsh conditions of her youth. On the 16th of April, as she sat in a chair in the infirmary, She clutched her crucifix and whispered her final prayers to the Mother of God. Her passing was as quiet as the wood-gathering trips of her childhood. She was laid to rest in a small chapel on the convent grounds, and the world began to move on. No one at that time could have predicted that, when her coffin was opened 30 years later, the dampness that had once caused her so much pain in life would have no power over her in death. The girl who had dug in the mud to find a miracle had become a miracle herself, waiting in the silence of the earth to reveal a mystery that defies every law of biology and decay. The world moved on, but in the heart of Nevers, within the small, stone-walled chapel of St. Joseph, a deep and profound silence took root. On the 30th of April, 1879, the heavy stone slab was finally lowered into place, sealing the vault. The air trapped within that chamber was cool and laden with the scent of damp earth and ancient lime. For the sisters of the convent of St. Gildard, the loss of Bernadette was a quiet ache, a void in their daily prayers that eventually softened into a gentle memory. As the months turned into years, and those years slowly stretched into decades, her physical presence became a story held only by the oldest among them. Outside the convent walls, the world was changing with a frantic energy. The industrial age was humming to life, steam engines were crossing the continent, and the 19th century was beginning its long, slow sunset into the 20th. Yet, beneath the floor of the chapel, in the dark, cold embrace of the earth, time seemed to hold its breath. The vault itself was a place of eternal autumn. Moisture seeped through the thick stone walls, a constant, gentle weeping of the earth that kept the air heavy and thick. This was not a dry or sterile tomb designed for preservation. It was an environment that, by every law of science and nature, should have accelerated the inevitable return to dust. The wood of the coffin, a modest casket of oak with a lead lining, sat in the center of this damp sanctuary. If you were to stand there in the absolute darkness, you might have heard the slow, rhythmic dripping of water against stone, a natural clock marking the passage of seconds that no human would ever count. The humidity remained high, the temperature a constant, chilling coolness. It was in this specific, hidden climate, a place perfectly suited for decay, that the mystery of the 30-year silence began to weave itself into the history of the Church. As the calendar turned from 1899 to 1900, a new century dawned with all its skepticism and modern wonder. But the process for the beatification of Bernadette Soubirous moved with the deliberate, patient speed of tradition. This formal path towards sainthood eventually required an identification of the remains, a task that demanded the opening of the tomb. By the time 1909 arrived, exactly 30 years had passed since the sister had been laid to rest. The people of Nevers, and the ecclesiastical world beyond, began to wonder what remained of the girl who had once seen a lady in a grotto. In the common understanding of the human body, 30 years is more than enough time for the damp earth to reclaim its own. The witnesses who would be present, the doctors, the bishops, and the elderly sisters, fully expected to find the somber, skeletal remnants of a life long finished. 2 doctors were chosen for this solemn task, Dr. David and Dr. Jordan. They approached the assignment with the clinical detachment of their profession, viewing it as a necessary bureaucratic step in a religious process. They were men of science, trained to understand the biological reality of what happens when life departs. They prepared their instruments and their minds for a scene of dust and brittle bone, discussing the likely state of the remains given the known moisture of the crypt. There was no expectation of a miracle in their notes, only the duty of verification. They expected the smell of the grave, that heavy, cloying scent of earth and rot that marks the end of all living things. The sisters who had known her as a young woman, now gray-haired and frail themselves, gathered in prayer, their hearts heavy with the reality that they were about to disturb the final rest of a dear friend. It was the morning of Wednesday, September 22nd, 1909. The air in Nevers was crisp with the approach of autumn, much like the air inside the chapel. At 8:30 in the morning, a small, somber procession made its way toward the chapel of Saint Joseph. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of reverence and a strange, clinical anticipation. The heavy masonry tools were brought in, and the sound of iron striking stone echoed through the hallowed space. A sharp, rhythmic clanging that broke the silence of 30 years. One can imagine the dust rising in the shafts of morning light, dancing in the air as the first stones were pried loose. The physical labor was intense and slow. The vault was a stubborn guardian. The men worked with a steady, laborious pace, their breaths visible in the cool air of the crypt as they reached the level where the coffin finally lay. As the final layer of earth and stone was cleared away, the oak casket was revealed. It was visibly darkened by the moisture of 3 decades, the wood showing the distinct signs of the damp environment it had inhabited for so long. The lead lining, designed to protect the wood, was tarnished and dull. The witnesses stepped closer, the flickering light of their candles casting long, dancing shadows against the damp walls. There was a moment of profound, shared breathlessness. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the weight of the unknown. The doctors adjusted their masks, their gloved hands steady, but their minds alert for the sight of the end. They expected to see the ravages of time, the skeletal collapse of a frame that had been so fragile in life. They prepared for the sight of decay. But as the lid began to lift, a soft, wooden creak announced the end of the 30-year silence. When the lid was fully removed, a collective gasp rose from the group, barely more than a whisper. The expectation was a landscape of gray and brown, a collection of fragments. They anticipated the sight of a tattered habit draped over a hollow frame. Instead, the light from the candles fell upon a form that defied the logic of the 30 years that had passed. There was no scent of decay, no odor of the earth. Instead, the air seemed strangely fresh, almost sweet. The doctors leaned in, their clinical detachment wavering as they looked upon the face of the woman who had been buried 3 decades prior. Her skin was a dull white, her head tilted slightly to the left, as if she were merely in the deepest of sleeps. The 30-year silence had not been a period of dissolution, but a period of preservation that the witnesses were not yet ready to believe. The doctors noted with astonishment that while the objects around her had succumbed to the moisture, she had not. The rosary in her hands was covered in rust, the metal links corroded and red. The crucifix she held had turned a deep, verdigris green. Even her religious habit was heavy and damp to the touch, clinging to her form. And yet, the hands that held that rusty rosary were perfectly preserved, the nails intact, the skin soft to the eye. Her face remained recognizable, her features clear and unchanged since the day she had closed her eyes for the last time. It was a scene that shattered the expectations of the men of science. In the damp darkness, where everything was meant to rot, Bernadette remained, a silent witness to a mystery that would soon captivate the world once more. The silence of the vault had ended, but a much greater conversation was just beginning. The morning of September 22nd, 1909, dawned with a quiet gravity over the convent of St. Gildard in Nevers. Inside the chapel of St. Joseph, the air was cool and thick, with the scent of old stone and lingering incense. A small, somber group had gathered for a purpose that sat heavy in their hearts. The first official exhumation of Sister Marie Bernard, known to the world as Bernadette Sauburus. It had been exactly 30 years since she had been laid to rest in the damp earth beneath the chapel floor. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic, muffled sound of tools as workmen began the arduous task of lifting the heavy stone slab. The air was filled with a tension that was not quite fear, but a profound, breathless anticipation. As the stone was slowly levered upward, a faint, earthy draft rose from the opening. The witnesses, including the Bishop of Nevers, the mayor, and the medical professionals, Dr. Jordan and Dr. David, stood in a semicircle, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of candles. The humidity in the vault was palpable. Moisture clung to the walls in shimmering beads. Every person present expected the inevitable reality of time. They expected the sharp, cloying scent of decay that follows 30 years of burial in a wet environment. They braced themselves for the sight of a collapsed casket and skeletal remains. The scrape of metal against stone echoed through the chapel, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of those watching the dark opening in the floor. When the double casket of lead and oak was finally brought to the surface and placed upon the trestles, a profound hush fell over the room. The exterior wood was dark with moisture, showing the clear signs of decades spent in the saturated ground. The workmen moved with a practiced, respectful slowness as they began to unscrew the lid. Each turn of the screwdriver seemed to take an eternity in the heavy silence. As the lid was finally lifted, the onlookers leaned forward, their breaths caught in their throats. But as the interior was revealed, the expected rush of foul air never came. There was no odor of putrefaction. Instead, there was only the scent of damp cloth and a strange, neutral stillness that defied all medical expectation. The sight that met their eyes was nothing short of staggering. There, lying within the damp folds of her religious habit, was Bernadette. Her head was tilted gently to the left, as if she had simply drifted off into a mid-afternoon nap. Her face was a dull, waxy white, but it was entirely intact. The skin was not stretched or skeletal. It clung to the muscles of her face with a soft, natural grace. Her eyes were closed, the lids resting perfectly over the sockets, and even her eyelashes remained visible, fine and dark against the pale skin. Her mouth was slightly open, revealing the glint of her teeth, still firmly in place. The doctors, seasoned men of science, stood paralyzed. This was not the decay they were trained to document. Dr. Jordan and Dr. David stepped closer, their movements tentative. They began their examination with a clinical but reverent touch. When they reached for her hands, which were crossed over her breast, they found them to be perfectly preserved. The fingernails were still there, translucent and neat. Most striking of all were the veins on her forearms. They stood out beneath the skin, clearly defined. The skin itself possessed a remarkable quality. When the doctors pressed upon it, it did not crumble or tear. It retained an elasticity that defied every law of biology they knew. It was, as they would later write in their sworn testimony, a state of preservation that was not a natural phenomenon, as the flesh remained soft and remarkably supple. The contrast between the body and the objects buried with her was perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. In her hands, Bernadette held a silver rosary. In the 30 years since the burial, the moisture of the tomb had done its work on the metal. The silver wire had oxidized, turning a dark, rusted black, and the beads were dull and corroded. The crucifix was covered in a layer of greenish-brown rust, and yet the fingers that held this decaying object were untouched. The dampness that had eaten into the metal and turned the habit into a moist shroud had seemingly retreated from her flesh. The rosary was a testament to the passage of time, while she remained a silent, incorruptible witness to something beyond the reach of the elements. The doctors continued their work for over 2 hours, documenting every square inch of the visible body. They noted the way her hair remained rooted under her veil, and the way the skin of her feet was as intact as that of her hands. The sisters who had known her in life wept quietly in the shadows of the chapel, recognizing the familiar curve of her brow and the stillness of her pose. The atmosphere in the chapel of St. Joseph had shifted from clinical investigation to profound mystery. As the examination drew to a close, the doctors looked at each other, their faces pale. They had come to verify a corpse. They had instead found a woman who appeared to be waiting for the morning to wake her. The lifting of the stone had revealed a secret that the earth had failed to consume. Within the walls of the convent of St. Gildard, a heavy, Reverent stillness settled over the Sisters of Charity. It was the autumn of 1909, and the world outside the cloister walls seemed to fade into a distant memory. The air in the hallways of Nevers carried the faint, sweet scent of lavender and beeswax, but beneath the familiar domesticity of the convent, there was a thrum of something eternal. The sisters moved in pairs, their wooden rosary beads clicking softly against their habits, a rhythmic, grounding sound that echoed in the stone corridors. They spoke in hushed tones, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves in a sanctuary. Word had spread through the infirmary that the exhumation was complete, and the reality of what had been found beneath the damp earth was beginning to sink in. They were no longer merely a community of mourning sisters. They were now the silent guardians of a miracle. The Bishop of Nevers arrived with a gravity that matched the profound occasion. He was accompanied by a formal delegation, a group of men dressed in black who brought with them the cold, analytical weight of the law. This was the beginning of the canonical recognition, a process where the spiritual met the procedural with absolute rigor. The sisters watched from the shadows of the arches as the postulator, the official tasked with guiding the cause for beatification, laid out his materials. He carried heavy leather-bound folders and crystal inkwells, transforming a simple wooden table in the scriptorium into a site of intense historical scrutiny. The church required more than just the witness of the eyes. It required a mountain of evidence, transcribed and verified with a precision that left no room for error. Every observation, every gasp of awe, and every tiny detail of the preservation had to be pinned down onto paper, destined for the archives in Rome. The postulator began the laborious task of gathering the process of information. This was the formal collection of every scrap of testimony regarding the life and death of the sister they had known as Marie Bernard. He sat for hours under the flickering light of a single tallow candle, his quills scratching rhythmically across thick sheets of vellum. The sound was hypnotic, a steady pulse in the quiet room. He documented the state of the oak casket, noting the way the moisture had seeped into the outer layers, but seemingly halted before reaching the remains. He recorded the lack of any miasma or odor of decay, replaced instead by a neutral, earthy stillness. Each page was numbered in careful, sweeping script, 1, 2, 3, extending into the hundreds as he wove together the medical reports and the spiritual reflections. This was the meticulous architecture of sainthood, built one sentence at a time, ensuring that the wonder they felt today would be preserved for centuries to come. The two doctors, Monsieur David and Monsieur Jourdan, provided the most startling chapters of this growing record. Their reports were clinical, yet even their professional detachment seemed to waver as they described the anatomical anomalies before them. They wrote of the skin, which remained supple and adhered to the muscles beneath as if the blood had only recently stopped flowing. They documented the hair, still rooted firmly in the scalp, and the fingernails, which were translucent and perfectly formed. Most baffling was the condition of the internal organs. When the examination reached that stage, they found the liver, an organ usually the first to surrender to the earth, to be soft and seemingly fresh. The postulator transcribed these findings with a steady hand, though the implications were profound. To the doctors, it was a medical impossibility. To the sisters, it was the physical manifestation of a soul that had been too pure for the grave to claim. But the process was designed by tradition to be skeptical. The Church employed a figure known as the promoter fidei, or the devil's advocate, whose role was to find any natural explanation for the preservation. In the convent, this meant a period of intense, wearying questioning. The soil of the garden was tested to see if it was particularly rich in minerals that might inhibit decay. The sisters were questioned about the burial. Had any secret chemicals been used? Had the body been treated in the dark of night? The answers were always a resounding no. The sister had been buried in a simple habit, with nothing but a rosary in her hands. The scrutiny was exhaustive, a cold wind of doubt meant to test the fire of their faith. Yet the more they looked for a mundane cause, the more the mystery deepened. The documentation grew thicker, bound by heavy twine and sealed with the red wax of the bishop's signet, a physical barrier against the skepticism of the outside world. Perhaps the most moving part of the documentation was the testimony of the elderly sisters who had lived alongside her for years. One by one, they were called into the small, wood-paneled room to speak. They did not talk of miracles or grand visions, but of the way she had scrubbed the cold floors despite her failing health. They spoke of her patience in the face of harsh rebukes and her quiet laughter in the kitchen. They recalled how she had once said that she was ground like a grain of wheat by her suffering. These stories were the heroic virtues the Church sought, the proof that her incorrupt body was merely a reflection of an incorruptible spirit. As the sun set over the Loire River, casting long, golden shadows across the convent walls, the sisters felt a profound sense of peace. The paperwork was nearly complete. The boxes of evidence were being prepared for their long journey across the mountains to the Vatican. The whispers in the convent were no longer of death, but of a coming light of a new dawn, as they waited for the world to recognize the saint who had lived so quietly among them. The memories of the sisters, those soft-spoken witnesses who had once shared a roof and a prayer with her, eventually gave way to the cold, analytical gaze of the official Church Commission. On the 3rd of April, in the year 1919, the heavy silence of the chapel of St. Joseph was broken by the rhythmic scraping of stone and the low, hushed murmurs of men in white coats. This was the second time her rest would be disturbed, a full decade after her body had first been brought into the light of the modern world. The air inside the vault was thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient stone, yet as the heavy lid was once again pried away, those present were met with a startling lack of the expected decay. There was no foul odor, no heavy scent of the grave, only the faint, sharp smell of the damp linen habit that clung to her small, still form. Doctors Talon and Kant, the men entrusted with this clinical vigil, stepped forward under the flickering glow of the lamps. Their report, written with the meticulous precision of men of science, noted that while the years had passed, the body remained remarkably intact. They observed patches of white mildew and a fine, crystalline layer of calcium salts that had bloomed across her skin like a delicate frost. This, they theorized, was a result of the washing her body had received during the first exhumation 10 years prior. To the eye, she appeared almost mummified, her skin having taken on a grayish, weathered tinge from the humidity of the vault. Yet, beneath this weathered exterior, the doctors found a structural integrity that defied the standard laws of biology. The teeth remained firmly in place within a slightly parted mouth, and the hands, though wizened, still gripped the rusted remains of her rosary with a quiet, eternal strength. 6 years later, the call for a final, definitive examination came as the process of her canonization neared its peak. On the 18th of April, 1925, a date that would be etched into the ecclesiastical records, the third exhumation took place. It had been 46 years since she had drawn her final breath in the infirmary, a span of time that should have reduced any mortal remains to dust and bone. The goal this time was more than just observation. It was the retrieval of sacred relics to be sent to the Vatican. The atmosphere in the room was one of profound solemnity, a bridge between the clinical requirements of the law and the spiritual expectations of the faithful. As the doctors prepared their instruments, the world outside waited for word on whether the incorruptible state of the young woman from the mountains would hold true under the most invasive scrutiny yet. Dr. Kant, perhaps the most focused of the examiners, recorded his findings with an almost breathless sense of wonder. As he worked to remove the 5th and 6th ribs from the right side of the chest to serve as relics, he found himself peering into the internal architecture of a body that had been dead for nearly half a century. He wrote of his desire to reach the heart, which he was certain would be found in a similar state of preservation. But the position of the body made such an extraction difficult without causing visible damage. Instead, his focus fell upon the liver. When he touched the organ, he found it not to be the hard, shriveled remnant one would expect, but rather a mass of soft and almost normal consistency. It was a detail that defied clinical expectation, a piece of the internal self that remained supple and recognizable, as if the blood had only recently ceased its flow. The examination continued down the length of her small frame, moving to the limbs that had once carried her through the muddy streets of her childhood. The doctors removed the kneecaps and took samples from the muscle fibers of the right femur. They found the tissue to be surprisingly firm and resistant, the ligaments still holding the skeleton together in a complete and perfect harmony. The skin, though it had shrunken and clung tightly to the contours of the bone, retained a quality of elasticity that puzzled the medical mind. Even as they detached fragments of muscle and skin to be preserved in gold and crystal reliquaries, the doctors noted the absence of any sign of putrefaction. There was no liquefaction of the brain, no collapse of the abdominal cavity, only a quiet, dry stasis that seemed to have captured her in a moment between life and the infinite. This clinical encounter, later documented in the medical bulletins of the era, served as the final evidence for the Church. The dark, blackish tinge of the face and the sunken features were noted, leading to the creation of the fine wax masks that now cover her remains to spare the public from the starkness of her weathered skin. But for the doctors who stood in that room in 1925, the miracle was not in the appearance, but in the texture of the flesh and the resilience of the internal organs. They had looked into the very core of a human being and found that time had been denied its usual victory. As the examination drew to a close, the eye of the Church had seen enough to declare that the girl who had once seen a lady in a grotto was, even in death, something far beyond the ordinary. The dark, blackish tinge that had so troubled the early observers was no longer just a matter of theological debate. By the time the late 20th century began to wane, the flickering candlelight of the ancient crypts was being replaced by the steady, sterile glow of halogen lamps. The transition from faith-based observation to clinical forensic analysis was a slow, quiet revolution. We move now into the 1980s, a decade where the Vatican, moving with a deliberate and cautious grace, decided to invite the eyes of modern science into the most sacred of spaces. This was not an attempt to debunk the divine, but rather an effort to understand the unique biological reality of these figures. The air in these hidden chambers changed. The scent of ancient incense began to mingle with the ozone smell of high-tech equipment. Paleopathologists and chemists, men and women who spent their lives deciphering the secrets of the dead, were granted access to the silent forms of the saints. They brought with them a new kind of reverence, one rooted in the precise measurement of cellular structures and the careful mapping of chemical compositions. The investigation of incorruptibility was no longer just a religious duty. It had become a sophisticated forensic endeavor, seeking to find the line where the natural world ends and the unexplained begins. Leading this scientific charge were specialists like Ezio Fulcieri and Luigi Capasso, researchers who approached the saints as complex biological puzzles. They arrived at the monasteries and cathedrals with portable X-ray machines that hummed with a low, vibrating energy and delicate endoscopes that could peer into the smallest of spaces without disturbing the ancient linens. Imagine the scene. A quiet, dimly lit room in an Italian convent, where a team of scientists in white coats works alongside silent, praying nuns. The sound of a needle-thin camera entering a small opening in a wooden sarcophagus is the only noise besides the rhythmic clicking of the monitors. These researchers began to build a new vocabulary, a way to categorize what they saw beyond the simple label of a miracle. They looked for signs of desiccation, which is the natural drying out of tissues in arid environments, and they looked for saponification, a process where the body's fats turn into a waxy substance called adipocere. They were searching for the distinction between a body that was merely preserved by the environment and one that had truly defied the expected laws of decay. It was a search for the truth hidden within the sacred dust, a quest to see if the physical remains could tell the story of their own preservation. The introduction of radiology and chemical analysis brought a sudden, startling clarity to many cases. For centuries, the Church had relied on visual inspections performed by local physicians who often lacked the tools to see beneath the surface. In the 1980s, the team from the University of Pisa uncovered a revelation that would change the narrative of one of Italy's most beloved figures. Saint Margaret of Cortona, whose 13th-century body had been celebrated for its lifelike appearance for over 700 years, was subjected to a thorough examination. As the scientists moved their sensors over her form, they discovered something that had been lost to history. Beneath the elaborate silk robes and the layers of sacred dust, they found small, deliberate incisions. These were not the marks of a miracle, but the careful work of human hands. Hidden within the body were traces of chemical resins, spices, and salts. It was discovered that, shortly after her death in 1297, her devoted followers had sought to preserve her through a sophisticated form of embalming. They had done so with such skill and secrecy that the fact had been forgotten by the very institution that guarded her. This discovery did not diminish her sanctity, but it provided a bridge between the spiritual and the physical, showing that the desire to keep a saint among the living was a powerful human drive that used the science of the time. As the forensic teams moved from one case to another, they began to isolate the variables that allowed for natural preservation. They noted that certain crypts acted as natural dehydrators, where a constant flow of cool, dry air would pull moisture from the skin before bacteria could begin the work of putrefaction. They studied the microenvironments of the lead-lined coffins, which could create an anaerobic state, a vacuum where oxygen-dependent microorganisms could not survive. In these cases, the body would become a dark, leathery shell, a process known as natural mummification. But even as they categorized these natural occurrences, they encountered bodies that did not fit the mold. There were remains that, despite being hundreds of years old, retained a level of pliability and moisture that defied forensic logic. While a mummy is brittle and fragile, sounding like dry cardboard when struck, these incorruptibles remained soft to the touch. The scientists found themselves looking through their microscopes at skin cells that seemed suspended in time, neither fully alive nor entirely surrendered to the earth. They began to use carbon dating to verify the age of the remains, ensuring that no modern interventions had taken place. Each test was a step closer to understanding the material reality of the sacred, yet each answer seemed to sprout two more questions. Then there was the mystery of the scent. For centuries, the odor of sanctity had been described by witnesses as a sweet, floral fragrance that emanated from the tombs of the holy. To a pilgrim, this was the breath of heaven. To a modern chemist, it was a volatile organic compound. Using gas chromatography, researchers sought to capture and analyze the molecules responsible for this fragrance. They found that in some cases, the scent was the result of the specific breakdown of certain fatty acids, which could produce a smell similar to roses or honey. In other cases, they found that the remains had been treated with aromatic oils centuries ago, the scents of which had become trapped in the porous structures of the bone and fabric, only to be released when the casket was opened. Yet, even with these chemical explanations, the timing and the intensity of the fragrance often remained an anomaly. The scientists would stand in the cool silence of the laboratory, staring at the printouts of molecular weights and peak values, realizing that even as they identified the ingredients of the scent, they could not fully explain why it persisted through the centuries. It was as if the body was holding onto its secrets, allowing the science to see the what, but never quite the how or the why. By the end of these intensive studies, the relationship between the Vatican and the scientific community had fundamentally shifted. The Church began to adopt a more rigorous, evidence-based approach to new claims of incorruptibility. They no longer saw science as a threat, but as a filter that could separate the purely natural from the truly extraordinary. The specialists had successfully categorized hundreds of remains, distinguishing between the desiccated, the saponified, and the chemically preserved. This process created a vast archive of data, a library of the physical state of the holy. But even as the ledger was filled with technical terms and radiological scans, a sense of wonder remained among the investigators. They had seen things that their textbooks said should not exist, fingers that could still bend after 5 centuries, and internal organs that remained soft and moist in graves that were otherwise bone-dry. The instruments had provided the measurements, and the sacred dust had been analyzed down to its elemental parts, yet the quiet presence of the saints in those cold rooms still carried a weight that no scale could record. The investigators realized that while they could map the cellular structures of the past, the spark that kept these forms from vanishing into the earth remained just out of reach, a ghost in the machine of their most advanced instruments. The transition from the hallowed halls of the Vatican to the sterile, echoing silence of the forensic laboratory was more than a change in scenery. It was a fundamental shift in how humanity approached the mystery of the undying. As investigators began to peel back the layers of tradition, they stepped away from the flickering candlelight and into the harsh, unyielding glow of scientific inquiry. The air in these ancient crypts, once thick with the scent of aged incense and centuries of prayer, now carried the sharp, clinical tang of chemicals and the heavy, damp smell of the earth itself. We find ourselves standing at the edge of the grave, not as pilgrims, but as observers of a complex biological dance that begins the moment a heart stops beating. Here, in the dark, the laws of nature do not always lead to dust. Sometimes, they lead to a strange, waxy immortality that defies our expectations of decay. At the heart of many of these supposedly miraculous preservations lies a substance known to science as adipocere, or more evocatively, grave wax. This material was first systematically described in the year 1786, when 2 French scientists, Antoine-François de Fourcroy and Michel-Augustin Thouaret, supervised the massive task of emptying the cemetery of the innocents in Paris. As they moved thousands of bodies to the catacombs, they discovered something startling. Many of the remains, particularly those of children buried in large, communal pits, had not turned to bone. Instead, they were encased in a crumbly, grayish-white substance that felt like hard soap or candle wax. This was the first time the chemistry of the grave was laid bare. They realized that under very specific conditions, the body's own fat could undergo a transformation that halts the typical path of decomposition in its tracks, creating a durable shell that can last for hundreds of years. This transformation is a process called saponification, which literally means soap making. It is a slow, methodical chemical reaction where the triglycerides in the body's adipose tissue are broken down through hydrolysis and hydrogenation. Imagine the moisture within the grave acting as a catalyst, splitting the fats into glycerol and free fatty acids like palmitic, stearic, and myristic acids. In a normal environment, these acids would simply vanish as the body returns to the soil. But when the grave is sealed and the air is still, these fatty acids begin to bond with minerals in the environment, becoming insoluble salts. The result is a solid, waxy mass that replaces the soft tissue, preserving the contours of the face, the shape of the hands, and even the internal organs in a state of eerie, suspended animation. It is as if the body has decided to manufacture its own tomb from within. For this chemical miracle to occur, the environment must be just right. The grave must be an anaerobic world, a place completely deprived of oxygen. In the deep, sealed stone sarcophagi of saints or the waterlogged soil of a valley, oxygen cannot reach the tissues to fuel the aerobic bacteria that typically cause putrefaction. Instead, the stage is set for anaerobic bacteria, such as Clostridium perfringens, to take over. These specialized microbes thrive in the dark and the damp, releasing enzymes called lipases that accelerate the breakdown of fats. Temperature also plays a vital role. While extreme heat can destroy the process and extreme cold can freeze it, a steady, temperate environment, perhaps between 21 and 45 degrees Celsius, allows the bacteria to work at their peak. It is in this narrow window of temperature and humidity that the flesh begins its long, slow turn toward the texture of a candle. The acidity of the surrounding earth, or the soil acidity, is the final piece of the puzzle. A mildly alkaline environment is the perfect cradle for grave wax. If the soil is too acidic, like the dark, peaty waters of a northern bog, the body will undergo a different kind of preservation, turning the skin to a dark, leathery brown. But in the alkaline embrace of limestone or certain types of clay, the saponification process is encouraged. The minerals in the soil or the stone casket migrate into the tissues, hardening the fatty acids into that characteristic white or yellowish crust. This explains why two people buried in the same cemetery might have vastly different fates. A few inches of difference in soil composition or the tightness of a coffin lid can mean the difference between becoming a skeleton in 5 years or a soap mummy that survives for 5 centuries. The sensory reality of these preserved bodies is often what led the faithful to believe they were witnessing a miracle. When a tomb is opened and a saint is found incorrupt, observers often describe the skin as having a pale, marble-like sheen. It is cool to the touch and firm, yet it possesses a strange, slight elasticity that bone never could. There is often a lack of the typical, overwhelming odor of death. Instead, fresh grave wax is said to have a sharp, ammonia-like scent that mellows over time into something more subtle, described by some as a sweet, cheesy, or even slightly floral aroma. To a medieval witness, this lack of rot and the presence of a mysterious, waxy substance was proof of a holy life. They did not see the anaerobic bacteria or the chemical breakdown of lipids. They saw a body that refused to yield to the indignity of the worm. As science began to map these chemical pathways, the boundary between the sacred and the material started to blur. We now understand that the chemistry of the grave is a precise and delicate balance of moisture, temperature, and biology. It is a natural process that occurs in forensic cases all over the world, from mountain lakes to modern cemeteries. Yet, even with all our knowledge of palmitic acids and soil alkalinity, there is a haunting quality to these remains that science cannot fully strip away. Whether we call it saponification or a state of grace, the sight of a face preserved through the ages remains one of the most profound encounters one can have with the reality of our own mortality. The grave wax does not just preserve the flesh. It preserves the questions we have about what remains of us when the breath is gone, and the long, cold silence of the earth begins. As science began to map these chemical pathways, the boundary between the sacred and the material started to blur. We now understand that the chemistry of the body has its own agenda, but for the faithful in the year 1925, the physical state of the beloved visionary Bernadette Soubirous presented a delicate challenge. After 46 years in the Earth of Nevers, the body was about to be moved to its final resting place in a crystal reliquary. However, the third and final exhumation revealed a truth that was difficult for the eyes of the public to reconcile with the concept of a miracle. While the body remained intact, showing no signs of the rot or the stench that usually accompanies death, the passage of decades had left its mark. The skin had darkened to a deep, blackish tinge, and the features of the face, once so vibrant and youthful during the apparitions at the grotto, had begun to sink into the hollows of the bone. The doctors present, including the diligent Dr. Kant, noted that the body was essentially mummified. It was a marvel of preservation, yes, but it was a stark, almost haunting sight that the church feared would shock the thousands of pilgrims who were expected to travel from across the globe to see their saint. The air in the convent was thick with a sense of responsibility. How does one present the sacred when the physical vessel has become a shadow of its former self? The decision was made to seek the help of an artist, but not just any artisan. They reached out to the firm of Pierre Imans in Paris. Imans was a man who understood the intersection of the human form and the gaze of the public. He was a celebrated designer of fashion mannequins, known for his ability to create figures that were startlingly lifelike, possessing a grace and a realism that filled the grand department store windows of the city. To bring a secular artist of fashion into the silent, prayerful halls of a convent might seem like a strange collision of worlds, but the church required a specific kind of expertise. They needed someone who could bridge the gap between a mummified reality and a spiritual ideal. Imans was commissioned to create what would become known as the waxen veil. Imagine the scene in those quiet rooms in 1925. The sculptor working with the utmost care, aware that beneath his hands lay the remains of a woman who had spoken to the divine. A precise imprint of Bernadette's face was molded directly from her features. This was not a creative interpretation, but a literal casting of her physical presence. From this mold, Imans crafted a mask of incredibly thin, light wax. He did the same for the hands, which had become skeletal and discolored over the nearly 5 decades since her death in 1879. The goal was to create a surface that would mirror the face as it appeared at the moment of her passing, peaceful, serene, and seemingly caught in the middle of a gentle sleep. The wax was applied with such precision that it rested like a second skin, a delicate layer that smoothed over the darkened patches and filled the sunken eye sockets where the light had once danced. When the process was complete, the transformation was profound. The saint was dressed in her religious habit, her hands crossed over her chest, clutching a rosary that had rusted from the dampness of the vault. The wax coverings on her face and hands gave her a soft, porcelain glow, creating an image of eternal rest that would eventually be viewed by millions. Even today, if you visit the chapel of Saint Bernadette in Nevers, you see her lying in a magnificent coffin of gold and crystal. To the casual observer, she looks as though she passed away only yesterday. But this peaceful image is the result of a complex dance between the natural preservation of the body and the artifice of the mask. The light in the chapel is kept low, casting long shadows that soften the edges of the reliquary, further blurring the line between the biological remain and the artistic tribute. It is a place of absolute silence, where the only sound is the rhythmic breathing of the pilgrims and the distant tolling of a bell. This intervention, however, sparked a debate that has simmered for almost 100 years. For some, the use of the wax masks is a form of deception, a way to hide the reality of decay and maintain a myth of perfect incorruptibility that doesn't truly exist in nature. Critics argue that by covering the blackening skin and the sunken eyes, the Church is presenting a curated version of holiness, one that favors aesthetic beauty over the raw, difficult truth of the mortal coil. They see the work of Pierre Imans as a high-fashion cover-up, a theatrical trick meant to sustain the faith of the ignorant. To these observers, the wax is a barrier to the truth, a plastic barrier that separates the believer from the actual, decomposing reality of the person they venerate. On the other side of the debate, the Church and many theologians view the wax as an act of profound dignity. They argue that the mask is not a lie, but a veil, a tradition rooted in the way we treat the dead with respect. Just as we dress a body in fine clothes or apply cosmetics for a viewing, the wax allows the faithful to look upon the saint without being repulsed or saddened by the harshness of mummification. It is meant to provide a relatable figure, a focal point for prayer that reflects the spirit of the woman rather than the chemistry of the tomb. They point out that the Church has never hidden the fact that the masks exist. The records of the exhumations and the commission of the imams firm are part of the public history of the case. In their eyes, the wax is a mercy, a way to protect the sleeping visionary from the prying, sometimes clinical eyes of a modern world that often struggles to find the sacred in the silence of a darkened chapel. As we sit in the stillness of our own thoughts tonight, consider the weight of that waxen veil. It sits between the living and the dead, between the miraculous and the manufactured. It is a thin, translucent boundary that reminds us of our own desire for beauty in the face of the inevitable. Whether you see it as a deceptive mask or a protective shroud, it remains one of the most striking examples of how we struggle to keep the past alive. The hands that once scratched the earth to find a healing spring are still there, resting beneath the work of a Parisian mannequin designer, waiting in the half-light of Nevers. The debate continues, but the silence of the saint remains unbroken, as the wax holds its shape against the slow, invisible movements of time. We are left to wonder what lies in the depths of that silence, beneath the layers of wax and the weight of a century. The 7th arrondissement of Paris holds a stillness that seems to defy the modern rush of the city outside its stone walls. At number 140, Rue du Bac, there is a chapel where time feels as though it has been suspended in a jar of amber. Here, the air is thick with the scent of melted beeswax, old wood, and the faint, lingering trail of incense that has soaked into the tapestries over decades. Pilgrims walk with soft steps, their shadows stretching long across the marble floor as they approach the glass reliquary. Inside, bathed in a soft light, lies the body of Saint Catherine Labouré. She rests in her habit, her hands joined in prayer, looking more like a woman lost in a deep, peaceful slumber than someone who left this world over a century ago. Catherine's journey to this glass coffin began far from the elegance of Paris, in the rolling hills of Burgundy. Born in 1806, she was a girl of the earth, one of 11 children born to a humble farmer. When her mother died, the young Catherine, only 9 years old, supposedly embraced a statue of the Virgin Mary and declared that she would be her mother from then on. This was a life defined by a quiet, ironclad devotion. She was uneducated and largely illiterate, described by those who knew her as unremarkable in every way except for her strikingly bright blue eyes. Those eyes saw things others could not, visions of light and celestial figures that would eventually lead to the creation of the miraculous medal. She died on December 31st, 1876, and was buried in a simple tomb. 57 years passed in the dark silence of the earth. In 1933, as part of the process for her beatification, church officials gathered to open her tomb. Imagine the sound of the heavy stones being moved, the damp scent of the cellar, and the collective intake of breath as the lid of the coffin was finally lifted. They expected to find white bones and dust, the natural return of the body to the clay. Instead, they found Catherine. Her skin was still supple, her face serene, and most unsettlingly of all, her blue eyes were said to be wide and clear, as if she had only just closed them a moment before. This discovery sent ripples through the scientific and theological communities alike. To the faithful, it was the ultimate proof of a life lived in perfect grace. But where faith sees a miracle, science often looks for a mechanism. The debate over incorruptibility frequently centers on a biological phenomenon known as adipocere, or grave wax. In certain environments, usually those that are cool, damp, and devoid of oxygen, the fats in a human body can undergo a process called saponification. This essentially turns the flesh into a hard, soap-like substance that resists decay and preserves the form of the individual for decades, or even centuries. Pathologists point to this as the likely explanation for why many so-called incorruptible saints appear so well-preserved. They argue that the microclimates of stone vaults and lead-lined coffins create the perfect laboratory for this natural mummification. To a chemist, Catherine Labouré is not a miracle, but a testament to the strange, slow alchemy of the Earth's chemistry, a biological anomaly. Theology, however, offers a counter-narrative that science struggles to fully dismantle. While grave wax might explain the preservation of shape, it rarely accounts for the reported flexibility of the limbs or the lack of the rancid smell typically associated with adipocere. In many of these cases, including Catherine's, witnesses reported the odor of sanctity, a sweet, floral fragrance like roses or lilies that emanated from the tomb upon opening. Furthermore, the Church points to the fact that other bodies buried in the exact same soil and conditions often crumble to dust while the saint remains whole. For the believer, this is the tension point. If the environment alone were responsible, why does the earth choose one over the other? They see it as a divine suspension of natural laws, a sign that the body, once the temple of a Holy Spirit, has been claimed. As we look upon Catherine today, behind her veil of glass and the thin layers of wax that have since been applied to her face to protect her from the air, we are forced to sit with the ambiguity. The unending debate between the biological and the divine does not seek a winner, but rather highlights our human need to find meaning in the face of death. Whether she is a product of saponification or a vessel of grace, she remains an anchor for those seeking a connection to the infinite. The mystery of the incorruptibles lies in that very gray area, where the cold facts of the laboratory meet the warm light of the chapel. Rest now, and let the questions drift away with the shadows as you sink deeper into the quiet comfort of your bed. The air inside the chapel of Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal in Paris is heavy with a specific kind of stillness. It is a silence that feels layered, like the dust of decades settled gently upon velvet. Here, at number 140 Rue du Bac, the world outside, the rushing taxi cabs and the vibrant life of the 7th arrondissement, seems to dissolve into a soft, hazy memory. As you step toward the altar, the floor beneath your feet feels solid and cool. This is where we find our final resting place, standing before the glass vault of Catherine Labouré. It is a place of quietude, where time is measured by the rhythmic flicker of amber candles. When the church authorities exhumed Catherine in 1933, it had been 57 years since her death in 1876. Those present expected to find the usual remnants of a life long past, the stark white of bone and tattered cloth. Instead, they were met with a sight that defied the natural order. Her body appeared as though she had merely closed her eyes for a brief rest. Her skin was supple, and her joints remained flexible, leaving observers in a state of breathless awe. To preserve this image for the thousands of pilgrims, a delicate layer of wax was applied to her face and hands. This wax serves as a bridge, maintaining her serene expression, offering a physical link to a vanished age. In the town of Nevers, Bernadette Soubirous rests within her own crystal shrine. Bernadette, the visionary of Lourdes, passed away in 1879, but her physical journey was far from over. After 3 separate exhumations between 1909 and 1925, the church sought a way to display her remains with dignity. They turned to Pierre Imans, a renowned designer of fashion mannequins in Paris. Imans was tasked with creating a light wax mask based on the imprints of her face and hands, which had begun to show a slight discoloration after decades in the damp earth. This collaboration created the visage we see today. It is a face of remarkable tranquility, forever poised in a silent and eternal prayer. Science offers its own vocabulary for these occurrences. Researchers speak of adipocere, often called grave wax, a soapy substance that can form in moist environments, effectively mummifying a body naturally. They point to the composition of the soil, the temperature of the vaults, and the airtight seals of the lead-lined coffins. To the analytical mind, The incorrupt saints are a fascinating study in rare biological outcomes. But for the faithful, these explanations do not diminish the wonder. They believe that even if the mechanism is natural, the intent is divine. The Church remains cautious, viewing the phenomenon as a physical manifestation of a life lived in close communion with the Holy Spirit, a sign rather than a definitive proof. Why do we travel hundreds of miles to stand before a body in a glass box? Perhaps it is because these figures represent our deepest human longing, the desire to remain. In a world defined by change and decay, the incorruptible saints offer a moment of permanence. They are a physical protest against the finality of death. When we look at the soft folds of their clothing or the peaceful curve of their eyelids, we are not just looking at the past. We are looking for a promise that something of us might survive the transition. We seek the peace of the incorrupt because we hope that their stillness is a precursor to a greater awakening beyond the dark veil. The legacy of these unfading saints is found in the echoes of the lives they led. Catherine Labouré spent 46 years caring for the elderly, never seeking fame for her visions. Bernadette lived a life of profound humility, retreating to the seclusion of a convent. Their bodies remain whole, but it is their spirits that have truly resisted the corruption of time. As we reflect on their story, we find ourselves in a space of deep contemplation. The odor of sanctity, that sweet fragrance often reported around these figures, is more than a scent, it is an atmosphere of grace. It invites us to consider what in our own lives is worth preserving, and what legacy we will leave behind. Now the lights in the chapels begin to dim, and the heavy doors are pulled shut for the night. The saints remain in their silent vigils, surrounded by cool stone and the lingering scent of incense. The questions of science and the fervor of faith both settle into the shadows. There is only the peace that comes from letting go, from accepting the mystery without needing to solve it. Like the saints in their crystal cases, you are now entering a time of stillness. The world and its many worries are far away. Your journey has reached its destination. There is no more searching, no more wondering. Sleep is the only companion left in this quiet, sacred space. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.